In this lesson, we're going to be going over different types of scans. So you'll hear people talk about scanning when we talk about ethical hacking. Scanning is often one of the first steps that you use in order to figure out what it is you're looking at and what the size of the breadbox is and what sort of tools you may need to be using in order to continue your ethical hacking activities. The first type of scan I'm going to cover here is a ping scan. Now, what a ping scan is just simply where you've got a utility that sends out echo requests to every system on a particular network or subset of a network so that you can determine which hosts are up. And I'm going to do just a simple ping scan here. And we're using Nmap for that. Nmap is a really handy utility for all sorts of things. And what Nmap is doing here, or has done, it sends out pings to every host on the network, and it's now showing the systems that it got responses from. There's a problem with ping scans. Sometimes systems are configured to block ICMP echo requests for the simple reason that they don't want to show up on the network. They figure that if they're blocking ICMP echo requests and they don't respond, it will just look like a black hole and that there's actually nothing sitting there, when in fact there is a system. Because of that, sometimes you don't want to do a ping scan, although sometimes it's useful just to do a quick ping scan and kind of figure out what's sitting out there. But don't assume that if you don't get a response from a system, that system is actually down. That's not necessarily the case. It could be blocking ICMP echo requests. You could also find instances where entire networks may be blocking ICMP echo requests inbound just simply for the reason of appearing to be black holes. And so if you can't be seen, you can't be attacked. Unfortunately, there are other ways of figuring out whether systems are up. If you've got a service or an application that is listening on the network because you need to provide a particular service, you can't hide that. So you may be able to block ICMP echo requests or pings, but you can't block requests to the open port. As a result, a different type of scan is something called a port scan. And a port scan is where we do connection requests to all of the ports on a particular system. And in the case of Nmap, you may do some subset of the 65,000 and some odd ports that are available on any particular system. Scanning 64K ports on every system can be very time consuming. And so Nmap has boiled it down to about 1,000 ports that it checks. The idea behind that 1,000 ports is you're going to hit the majority of applications that may be listening with those 1,000 ports. Sure, people can protect themselves by putting all of their services on completely oddball ports outside of that 1,000 port range that Nmap scans. But if you do that, then you're not going to be able to get people to easily come and make use of your services, which sort of defeats the purpose of having them to begin with. So a port scan, we're going to use Nmap again, and the type of scan that I'm going to be doing here requires administrative privileges, so again you can see me using sudo here to run Nmap, and I'm just going to do a simple TCP connect scan. And I'm going to run it again on my entire network here. And what it's going to be doing is issuing a TCP SYN packet to all of the ports on every system on the network. Now, by default, Nmap will do a ping initially, and it won't follow up if the system doesn't respond with a ping. We can do something about that by saying, don't do the ping. But this is simply a TCP scan using Nmap. Every host on the network is going to get checked for the 1,000 or so ports that Nmap checks, and it's going to start returning responses with open ports on the network. A TCP connect scan is different from a simple SYN scan with Nmap because with a TCP connect scan, what Nmap is going to do is follow up a SYN ACK with an ACK and complete the three-way handshake. One reason you may want to do this is because if you start throwing out a whole bunch of sins and leaving a whole bunch of half-open connections sitting around on a network, you may get noticed. Now, it's possible you may get noticed with a TCP Connect scan because it generates a lot of traffic, but what you're not doing is just throwing a whole bunch of SYN packets out and not following up, which is definitely something that's worth flagging. Just a lot of traffic may or may not be worth flagging for somebody, and so you may want to do a TCP Connect scan in order to avoid detection, or simply just to be polite on the network and not leave those half-open connections around. And you can see that we're starting to get responses back here on some of the systems that have open ports. Another type of scan is a vulnerability scan. Now, there's a big difference between a vulnerability scan and the type of scans that we've been looking at so far. A vulnerability scan is looking for specific vulnerabilities on a system. Now, that doesn't mean that they go checking all sorts of exploits to see whether the vulnerability responds. What it means is we check things like open ports, and we check for applications and versions, and we check that against a database to see whether that particular version is vulnerable or not. If an application doesn't respond with a version, then we can't say for sure whether it's vulnerable. You can end up with a lot of systems that may potentially be vulnerable to a particular vulnerability, but may not show up in a vulnerability scan simply because the vulnerability scanner couldn't figure out the application or the version in order to check the database to see whether it may be vulnerable or not. So there's a downside to vulnerability scanning, although it's definitely a worthwhile activity and can certainly point you in directions that you want to be looking for as you continue through this process. Another thing that port scanners are useful for is to check for application banners to see whether there's a particular application running, and vulnerability scanners certainly use port scanners and do that banner grabbing activity, and port scanners can also check for operating systems and versions because of the way they get responses back from the targets that are being scanned. Vulnerability scanners also make use of that sort of information in order to determine whether they're vulnerable. So that's just a few different types of scans that you would be using as you begin ethical hacking.